Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Well of Barhout. You are a herder in the deserts of eastern Yemen, near the border with Oman, in a flat and featureless province called Al-Mara. You have walked this ground your whole life, and your father walked it, and his father before him, and all of them told you the same thing. There is a hole in the desert. You can walk right up to its rim. You can lean over and feel the cool air rising out of it, carrying a smell you do not like. And you do not, under any circumstances, go down into it, or speak carelessly near it, or throw anything into it that you would want returned. The hole has a name. The people call it the Well of Barhout, and in the stories, it is a prison. The opening is roughly 100 feet wide, a near-perfect circle punched into the desert floor. From the rim, it drops away into darkness, and the shaft goes down more than 350 feet, wider at the bottom than at the top, like the inside of a bottle. No stream feeds it, no river carved it. It is a sinkhole, dissolved out of the rock over a span of time that dwarfs every human story ever told about it, and humans have told a great many stories about it. For as long as there has been an oral tradition in this part of Arabia, the Well of Barhout has been described as a place where evil is held, a prison for the jinn, the spirits of Islamic tradition, a well of the dead. A door that is best left shut. The smell was real. People who approached the rim reported a foul odor rising from below. Birds, the herders said, would not fly across the opening, and so for centuries, in a region continuously inhabited since antiquity, in a culture that produced sophisticated engineers and traders, this hole in the ground sat unexplored. Not because the technology to descend it did not exist. Rope existed. Courage existed. Curiosity existed. But nobody used any of it here. The rule was simpler and stronger than curiosity. You do not go down. Here's where it gets strange. The refusal is the phenomenon. Think about what it takes for a taboo to survive that long. Generation after generation stood at the edge of an obvious mystery, an enormous, gaping question in the middle of the desert, and generation after generation chose not to answer it. That is not laziness. Laziness forgets. This was remembered, deliberately, and enforced, and passed down with specificity, the way you pass down something you believe is true and dangerous. The people of Al-Mara built an institution out of not knowing, and they maintained it more faithfully than most institutions maintain anything. It held until September 2021. That was when a team from the Omani Cave Exploration Team, experienced cavers with modern equipment, traveled to the site and did the thing no local tradition would permit. 8 of them descended. They rigged ropes over the rim and lowered themselves through the cool rising air, past the point where the daylight failed, all the way to the bottom, more than 300 feet down. What they found was both a relief and, in its own way, more unsettling than the legend. There were no demons. There was no imprisoned evil, no door to the underworld. But there was a strange, secret world that had been sealed off from the sky for an unknown span of time. The floor was scattered with the bones and carcasses of animals that had fallen in and could not climb out. There were snakes, living ones, coiled in the dark. There were cave pearls, smooth stones formed drop by drop over centuries, and waterfalls seeping through the rock. The foul smell, the explorers concluded, came from the dead animals and stagnant pockets of the cave, ordinary decay in an enclosed space. The bird avoidance and the sense of dread, the mundane explanation goes, were the natural human response to a deep dark hole that exhales rotting air, and yet the team could not fully explore it. The well is large and complex, and a single descent could not map all of it. The bottom of the Well of Barhout has still not been completely documented, and the deeper question, the one the ropes could not reach, remains exactly where it was. Why here? Because the mundane explanation only explains the smell. It does not explain why a culture surrounded by other sinkholes, other caves, other dark places, singled out this one, gave it a name that means imprisonment, and defended a rule of avoidance around it for 1,000 years. Something happened, at some point in the deep past, that made the people of this desert decide that this particular hole was a threshold that should not be crossed. The memory of the rule survived long after the memory of the reason was lost. What did they know? What went into that well, or came out of it, long enough ago that only the taboo remained? And now that the taboo is broken, and the ropes have touched the bottom, what did the cavers walk past in the dark that they did not have the time, or the light, to see. From this desert well, we climb now to a glacial lake in the Himalayas, where the dead keep arriving, 1,000 years apart, with no explanation for either group. Number 2. Roopkund. The year is 1942. You're a British forest ranger patrolling the Nanda Devi Reserve in what is now the Indian state of Uttarakhand, more than 16,000 feet above sea level, where the air is thin enough to slow your thoughts and the cold gets into the seams of everything you own. You have climbed for days to reach a small glacial lake tucked into a bowl of rock and ice. It is late summer, the one brief window when the surface thaws. You crest the final ridge, look down at the water, and at first you think the pale shapes along the shoreline are stones. Then you get closer. They are not stones. They are skulls. The lake is roughly 130 feet across and, at its deepest, barely shoulder height. A person could wade most of it. And along its edges and across its shallow floor lie the bones of hundreds of human beings. Not 2 or 3, not a dozen. When the ice recedes each year, the water gives up somewhere between 300 and 800 skeletons, along with hair, fingernails, and scraps of leather preserved by the cold. Ranger H.K. Madwal filed the report that reached the outside world in the middle of the Second World War, and for a moment the British wondered if they had found Japanese soldiers infiltrating through the mountains. They had not. The bones were far too old for that. The site is called Roopkund. The people of the surrounding villages had always known it was there, and they had a story about it, passed down through the folk songs of the region for as long as anyone could remember. A king and queen had traveled into these mountains on a pilgrimage to honor the goddess Nanda Devi, and they had brought a loud, careless retinue of servants and dancers. The goddess, offended by the noise, sent a storm down so violent that it killed the entire party where they stood and swept their bodies into the little lake. For centuries this was treated as legend, a story to explain a strange thing. Then the scientists arrived with their instruments, and the legend started to look less like a story and more like a memory. Radiocarbon dating placed many of the skeletons at around the 9th century AD, roughly 1,200 years old. And the skulls revealed something specific and disturbing. A large number of the dead had died the same way, from short, sharp, blunt force blows to the top of the head and shoulders, not the sides. Not the front, the top. Whatever killed these people came from directly above, striking downward, heavy and round. The leading explanation is a sudden and catastrophic hailstorm, hail the size of cricket balls, falling on a group caught in the open with nowhere to shelter at 16,000 feet. It fits the folk song almost exactly. Death from the sky, in an instant, with no escape. Here's where it gets strange. In 2019, a team spanning 28 institutions, including the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad, Harvard Medical School, and the Max Planck Institute, published a genetic study of 38 of the Roopkund skeletons in Nature Communications. They expected to confirm a single mass death. Instead, the DNA told them the bones in this one small pool did not all belong together. There were at least 3 genetically distinct groups. One was South Asian, consistent with the people of the region, dead around the 9th century, matching the hailstorm dates. But another was not South Asian in the slightest. Their genetic signature pointed to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the area of modern Greece and Crete, and they had not died in the 9th century. They had died around 1800 AD, nearly 1,000 years after the first group. Sit with that. 2 separate mass deaths of 2 genetically unrelated populations, separated by a full millennium, ended in the same pool barely 130 feet wide, on a Himalayan slope 4 days' hard climb from anything. The South Asians can be explained by the pilgrimage route and the storm. The Mediterranean group cannot be explained at all. There is no record of a party of Greek travelers dying in the Indian Himalayas around 1800, no expedition log, no missing persons. No trade route that would put dozens of Eastern Mediterranean people at 16,000 feet in the Nanda Devi sanctuary. The isotopes confirm they ate a different diet than the locals, so they were not a resident community. They came from somewhere else, for some reason no document records, and they died in the exact place the first group had died 1,000 years before. The lake keeps them. Every summer the ice pulls back and returns the dead to the surface, and every winter it takes them again. The Indian government has restricted access, though for decades, trekkers carried skulls home as souvenirs. Who were the strangers from the Mediterranean? Why did two crowds of people, 1,000 years apart, share the same tiny grave? And what is it about this particular basin of ice water that keeps drawing people to die in it? The folk song only explains the first crowd. Nobody has written the song that explains the second. Number 3. Hoyo Negro. The year is 2007. You're a cave diver, one of a small number of people on Earth trained to do what you are doing right now, finning slowly through a flooded limestone tunnel a couple 100 feet back from the nearest air, deep beneath the jungle of the Yucatan, with only the beam of your light between you and total, permanent darkness. You have been following a passage in a cave system called Sac Actun, threading through rooms hung with stone icicles that formed when this cave was dry, thousands of years ago, before the sea rose and drowned it. Then the tunnel ends, and your light does not find a wall, it finds an edge. The floor drops away in front of you into a void so large your beam cannot reach the far side or the bottom. The Mexican divers who found it gave it the only name that fit, Hoyo Negro, the black hole. The pit is a bell-shaped dome, roughly 180 feet across and more than 100 feet deep, buried at the intersection of several flooded tunnels, far from any natural entrance. Only elite technical divers can reach it, hauling multiple tanks and staged decompression gas through a maze where a wrong turn means running out of air in a place no rescuer can follow. Alberto Nava, Alejandro Alvarez, and Franco Attolini were the divers who dropped over the edge and descended into the black. What their lights revealed on the floor of the pit rewrote a chapter of human history. The bottom of Hoyo Negro is a graveyard of the Ice Age. Scattered across the sediment lay the bones of creatures that have not walked the earth for more than 10,000 years. Giant ground sloths the size of cars, gomphotheres, elephant relatives with tusks, saber-toothed cats, ancient bears, and among the monsters, small and unmistakable, a human skull. She was a teenage girl, 15 or 16 years old when she died. The researchers named her Naya, after the water nymphs of Greek myth, and when scientists dated her remains, published in the journal Science in 2014, the number stopped them cold. Naya is between 12,000 and 13,000 years old, one of the oldest, most complete human skeletons ever found in the Americas. When she was alive, this pit was not underwater at all. It was a deep, dry shaft in a cave, and it worked as a natural trap. Animals wandering in the dark, and one young woman, fell over the unseen edge and could not get out. They died at the bottom, in the dark, together. Then, as the last ice age ended and the glaciers melted, sea levels rose, the water table beneath the Yucatan climbed, and the pit slowly filled from below. The trap sealed itself under 100 feet of water and held its dead for 13,000 years, until 3 divers with modern gear dropped into the black and found them. Here's where it gets strange. Naya's remains do not fully cooperate with the story we tell about who the first Americans were. Her mitochondrial DNA links her to a lineage still found in living Native Americans today, which supports the standard model that the first people came from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge. That part fits, but her skull does not. Naya and the other very early Paleo-Americans have narrow skulls with features distinctly different from those of later Native Americans, different enough that some researchers once argued the earliest Americans must have been a separate population from an entirely different origin. Her genetics say she belongs. Her skull says she looks like a stranger. Both are true at once, and reconciling them has forced a rethinking of how the first people entered and changed across this hemisphere. She is still down there, more or less. Some remains have been carefully studied and recovered by teams working with Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, but the pit itself is not a place the public will ever visit. It is sealed by geography more absolute than any locked door. To reach it, you must be one of a handful of divers, with the training to survive the journey, carrying your own air into a lightless, flooded labyrinth, with the pit yawning at the end. Access is not restricted by a government. It is restricted by death. Consider what this place is. A pit that spent one age as a dry trap, catching the giants of the Ice Age and one young woman, and spent the next age as a drowned vault, preserving them in cold, still, oxygen-poor water that kept the bones intact across 13 millennia. The same geology that killed them saved them. Who was Naya? How did a 15-year-old girl come to be walking a dry cave in total darkness 13,000 years ago, alone with the animals, at the edge of a pit she could not see. Why do the oldest faces in the Americas look so unlike the people who came after them, if the blood says they are the same? Hoyo Negro answers one question and opens three. The Ice Age is still at the bottom, waiting in the dark. The next cenote on this list shows you something different when you descend, visible from 100 feet down, exactly where the ancient Maya said the underworld would be. Number 4. Cenote Angelita. The year is now, or any year in the last 2 decades, because this place does not change on any scale a diver can measure. You are descending a rope through clear, turquoise fresh water in a flooded limestone shaft near the town of Tulum, on the northeastern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. The walls around you are white karst rock, hung with tree roots that have pushed down from the jungle floor above, searching for moisture in the dark. You are in a cenote, one of the thousands of natural sinkholes that riddle the limestone shelf of this peninsula. The Maya considered them mouths of the earth. The water inside them is almost impossibly clear, 60 feet down, 70, 80, and then the world below you dissolves. At roughly 100 feet, the water stops being water. A layer of white cloud stretches from wall to wall of the cenote, a vast opaque curtain hanging in the middle of the shaft, so thick you cannot see through it. And rising from that cloud, unmistakably, are trees. Dead, bare, gray trees, their trunks planted upright and their branches reaching toward you. Below the cloud, visible in glimpses through the haze, is a floor, a topography, another landscape suspended inside this one. You are floating above what looks like a river. The river is inside the earth, and the earth is underwater, and you are looking, from 100 feet down in a flooded sinkhole, at what every instinct in your body names as the entrance to the underworld. The ancient Maya, who lived above this water for thousands of years, told their descendants exactly this. And looking at it, it is not a metaphor. It looks exactly like what they said. Cenote Angelita drops to roughly 210 feet. For the first 100, it holds fresh water, fed by rain percolating down through the limestone shelf. Below that, because the cenote connects to the sea through passages in the rock, there is denser, older salt water, sitting in a stable layer that the two water types do not easily mix across. The boundary between them is called a halocline. What makes Cenote Angelita different from every other cenote on the peninsula is the band of hydrogen sulfide gas that has accumulated in the transition zone, produced by organic matter decomposing between fresh and salt for centuries in the dark. The gas is visible. It forms a curtain of white haze about 15 feet thick that cuts the shaft in half and makes the salt water below look exactly like a river flowing through an underground landscape. The dead trees standing through it are real trees, their trunks long since calcified and stripped bare by the salt and the time. They have stood in that cloud since before the water rose to take them. The river is not a river. But no one who has descended into Cenote Angelita has been able to convince their eyes of this. Here's where it gets strange. The Maya did not need to dive to 100 feet to believe that cenotes were portals to the underworld. They believed it because the evidence was visible from the surface. Look into the water. Something lies below. Another light, another color, a depth the eye cannot resolve. They called the underworld Xibalba, the place of fear, and described it as a realm directly below the water, reached by going down. In the ancient Maya texts, the lords of Xibalba lived beneath rivers that divided the dead from the living. At Cenote Angelita, there is a river. Archaeologists working cenotes across the Yucatan have found what the Maya gave to these thresholds across centuries: ceramic vessels, jade objects, rubber balls from the sacred ball game, human remains. At the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza, offerings and people were cast into the water to reach the lords below. At Cenote Angelita, divers who cross the halocline and descend into the salt layer find artifacts resting on the floor, not scattered by currents, placed. Things someone carried to the edge of the fresh water, lowered into the cloud, and let the underworld take. What did the person who gave those objects to the cloud believe was waiting on the other side? The priests who worked these cenotes were not performing superstition. They were making careful observations. They looked down and saw another world. They deduced that the water was the threshold between the living world and the dead one. They were right that another world lies below the surface. They were right that crossing the boundary changes something. They were describing, in sacred language, exactly what the geology was doing in fact. What else is resting on the floor of that salt layer, at 200 feet, in water that has not touched the surface in thousands of years. Reaching it requires technical diving gear and staged decompression gas, and most divers stop at the halocline. Most of what lies below has never been examined. Whatever was placed down there is still there. The salt preserves. The depth protects. The water holds what is given to it, exactly as it has held everything else on this list, and it does not give it back. From a cenote where the water conceals an entire world inside itself, we travel now to a lake that does something different with what falls in. This lake does not hide. It transforms permanently into stone. Number 5. Lake Natron. You are a bird flying over the East African Rift, in the north of Tanzania, near the border with Kenya, and below you is a lake the color of blood. It is not a metaphor. The water is genuinely, vividly red, streaked with white and orange, a wound in the pale desert. You are a lesser flamingo, and this is the only place on Earth your kind will nest, 3/4 of your entire species born on the crusted islands in the middle of this red water. You come here because nothing else does. Nothing that would hunt your eggs can survive what is in this lake. But that same water that protects you is the water that will, if you falter and go down into it, turn you to stone. Lake Natron is a soda lake, one of the most extreme bodies of water on the planet. It is fed by hot springs that rise through the volcanic rock of the rift, carrying enormous quantities of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, natural mineral salts that the surrounding land has no rivers to flush away. The water sits in a shallow basin under a punishing sun, evaporating and concentrating year after year until the chemistry becomes something closer to a laboratory reagent than a lake. The alkalinity climbs to an acidity level of around 10.5, approaching the strength of household ammonia. In the dry season, the surface temperature can reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The red color comes from microscopic salt-loving organisms that bloom across the lake and stain it crimson. For almost anything not specially adapted to it, the lake is lethal. And here is the detail that has given Lake Natron its reputation as a place of quiet horror. The sodium carbonate that saturates the water is a preservative. It is chemically related to natron, the very same mineral compound the ancient Egyptians harvested from desert lakes and used to dry out and preserve the bodies of their pharaohs. Natron is what made mummification possible. It draws the moisture out of flesh and halts decay, and Lake Natron is a lake of it. So when an animal dies in or near the water, a bird that lands wrong, a bat, a small creature that wanders in, the lake does not let the body rot away. It preserves it. The high salts and the drying chemistry calcify the remains, coating them in a hard mineral crust, fixing them in place exactly as they died. In 2013, the photographer Nick Brandt traveled to Lake Natron and collected some of these preserved animals from along the shoreline. Birds and bats calcified by the water and posed them as if they were still alive, perched and poised. The images went around the world. Flamingos frozen mid-motion, turned to gray stone, eyes still closed. A lake that mummifies whatever it takes, without a priest, without a ceremony, without any intention at all. Just chemistry, doing to a bat in a shallow pool exactly what it took Egyptian embalmers 70 days of careful work to do to a king. Here's where it gets strange. This lethal, petrifying, blood-red lake is also a cradle. The lesser flamingos of East Africa, millions of them, depend almost entirely on Lake Natron to reproduce. They build their nest mounds on the caustic salt flats in the center of the lake, in the one season the conditions allow, precisely because no predator, no jackal, no larger bird, no human will cross that burning alkaline water to reach their eggs. The thing that makes the lake deadly is the thing that makes it a sanctuary. Life clusters most densely in the one place that kills most reliably, because death is the wall that keeps everything else out. And the lake sits in a landscape as strange as the water. Rising directly beside it is Old Duino Lengai, which in the language of the Maasai who live here means the mountain of God. It is the only active volcano on Earth that erupts a rare, cool, black lava made of the same sodium and carbonate compounds that feed the lake, lava so unusual it exists nowhere else. The Maasai have regarded the mountain as sacred for as long as their people have lived here. And not far from the lakeshore, at a place called Engar Cerro, a stretch of hardened volcanic ash preserves the footprints of ancient humans who walked past this red water somewhere between 19,000 and 5,000 years ago. More than 400 prints, one of the largest collections of ancient human footprints in Africa. People have been walking the shore of the stone-making lake since the last ice age. The mundane explanation is complete and correct. There is nothing supernatural here. It is salt, heat, and time, an ordinary consequence of geology in one of the most violent places on the planet. But knowing the chemistry does not make the sight of a calcified flamingo any less unsettling, and it does not answer the question the lake keeps posing. What does it mean that the same substance the Egyptians used to preserve their god-kings for eternity lies in a natural lake in Tanzania, doing the same work on anything unlucky enough to fall in? An entire lake of it sits beneath the mountain of God, red as blood, hot as a fever, ringed by footprints 20,000 years old, turning birds to stone. From a lake that turns the dead to mineral, we go now to a sacred cenote where what fell in did not fall by accident. It was given deliberately, for centuries. Number 6. The Sacred Cenote. The year is 1904. Your Edward Herbert Thompson, an American diplomat serving as consul in Yucatan, standing at the edge of a hole in the earth that the ancient Maya believed opened directly onto the world of the dead. Below you, 60 feet straight down, is a disk of green water, almost 200 feet across, ringed by sheer limestone walls, slick with roots and moss. There is no beach, no gradual entry, no way in except to fall. The water is the color of old jade, and you cannot see into it. You have bought this entire ruined city, the great Maya capital of Chichen Itza, largely so you can find out what is at the bottom of this well. And what you are about to pull out of it will confirm the darkest stories the Spanish friars recorded 4 centuries ago. The Maya called it a cenote, a natural sinkhole where the limestone bedrock has collapsed to reveal the groundwater beneath. The Yucatan has no rivers. Every drop of fresh water the Maya drank came from cenotes, which made them sacred by necessity. But this particular cenote, the one the Maya named the Well of Sacrifice, was never used for drinking. It was used for offerings. 16th century accounts, most famously by Bishop Diego de Landa, describe the Maya throwing valuables and human beings into it during droughts, as gifts to Chak, the god of rain, believed to live in its depths. For centuries, scholars treated the account with suspicion. De Landa was a zealot who had burned the Maya books. Perhaps he had exaggerated. Thompson dredged the cenote from 1904 to 1910, hauling up bucket after bucket of black mud, and later he learned to dive it himself in a canvas suit and copper helmet, groping blind through water so dark his hands vanished in front of his face. What came up ended the debate. Gold discs hammered with images of battle, jade beads and carved pendants, copal incense still holding its shape, sacrificial knives, and bones. Human bones, hundreds of them, brought up from the muck at the bottom of the well. The remains went to the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and over the decades osteologists studied them. The count of individuals recovered runs well over 100, and later work has pushed it higher. The bones tell a specific and unsettling story. They are not, as an old romantic legend claimed, mostly beautiful young maidens. They are men, women, and, above all, children. A large share of the recovered remains belong to individuals between the ages of 3 and 11. Many of the bones show the marks of ritual violence, cut marks, and blunt trauma consistent with the victims being killed before they entered the water. Here's where it gets strange. This was not a one-time panic during a single terrible drought. The offerings span centuries, layer on layer, a continuous practice maintained across the rise and fall of dynasties. Generation after generation, the people of Chichen Itza walked to the edge of this specific well and gave it their gold, their craftsmanship, and their children, in a sustained relationship with the water that lasted longer than most nations survive. The cenote was not a place of desperation. It was infrastructure, a permanent channel between the living city above and whatever the Maya were certain was listening below the surface. The water itself makes the offering nearly irreversible. Below the visible surface, the cenote descends around 40 feet, and the lower layers are choked with fine, light-absorbing sediment and, in places, with hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg gas that collects where organic matter decays without oxygen. Visibility drops to nothing. Modern divers working the site under the National Institute of Anthropology and History describe a column of clear water that gives way, near the bottom, to a suspended cloud of black silt where their lights simply stop, and where their hands find bone before their eyes find anything at all. Whatever went into this well was meant never to come back. The water closed over it and kept it. Those divers are still working the sacred cenote. They are still bringing up bones. Nearly every serious investigation of the bottom recovers more, which means no one has ever reached the true floor of the offerings. We do not have a final count of the dead. We may never. The Maya chose this cenote out of the thousands that pockmarked the Yucatan, and they made it the mouth of their god. Consider what that required. A shared, sustained certainty, held for centuries by an entire civilization, that if you gave the water enough gold and enough children, the rain would come. And here is the part no archaeology can settle. Sometimes, after the offerings, the rain did come. Enough times that the practice never stopped. Who decided which children went into the water? How does a society keep that agreement for 500 years without a single generation refusing? And what did the Maya believe was waiting at the bottom of that green water, patient in the dark, that a golden disk and a drowned child could persuade? The Maya chose what the water received. The next water took without asking, swallowing a ship and an object the world spent 2,000 years trying to understand. Number 7. The Antikythera wreck. The year is 1900. You're a Greek sponge diver in a heavy canvas suit and a copper helmet, breathing air pumped down a hose from a boat rocking on the surface 150 feet above your head. You and your crew have taken shelter from a storm in the lee of a tiny, barren island called Antikythera, in the deep water between Crete and the mainland. To pass the time, you have gone down to look for sponges. You touch bottom in the gloom, your weighted boots stirring the silt, and you turn your lamp toward a shape in the murk, and you freeze. There are bodies on the sea floor. A tangle of human figures, arms and torsos and faces, half buried in the sand. You come up too fast, babbling about a heap of the dead. Your captain thinks the pressure has damaged your mind. It has not. What you saw were bronze and marble statues, and you have just found the richest ancient shipwreck ever discovered. The wreck was a Roman-era cargo ship that went down around the 1st century BC, near the year 60 before Christ, carrying a staggering load of Greek treasure, statues, glassware, jewelry, and luxury goods, probably bound for wealthy buyers in Italy. When the storm took it, the ship sank to the sloping seabed at a depth that pushed the very limits of what a diver in 1900 could survive. The Greek government organized the first major underwater archaeological recovery in history, and the sponge divers went back down, again and again, into water so deep that no one yet understood what it was doing to their bodies. It killed one of them. Decompression sickness, the crippling and sometimes fatal condition that strikes divers who surface too quickly, was barely understood at the turn of the century. As the men worked the wreck at 150 feet and more, staying down longer than any body should at that pressure, nitrogen built up in their blood and tissues, and when they came up, it came out of solution, as bubbles forming in their blood and joints and tissue, the way gas erupts from a pressurized vessel the moment the seal gives. Only this time the vessel was a living body. One diver died. 2 others were left paralyzed. The wreck extracted a price in human bodies before it gave up its cargo, and the men who paid it were reaching, though they could not have known it, for one of the most important objects ever pulled from the sea. Because among the corroded statues and broken pottery, the divers brought up a shapeless lump of bronze and rotten wood, so unremarkable that it sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for months before anyone looked at it closely. When it cracked open, there were gear wheels inside. Precisely cut, interlocking bronze gears, dozens of them, machined with a delicacy no one associated with the ancient world. Here's where it gets strange. The object, now called the Antikythera mechanism, is a computer. Not a metaphorical one, a literal analog computer, a hand-cranked device of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears that modeled the movements of the heavens. Turn the crank, and it calculated the positions of the sun and the moon, tracked the phases of the moon, predicted solar and lunar eclipses years in advance, and followed the cycles of the ancient Greek calendar and the timing of the Olympic Games. It is more than 2,000 years old, and the level of precision engineering it represents does not appear again anywhere in the surviving record of human history for well over 1,000 years, not until the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe. A device this sophisticated, this far ahead of everything around it, sitting on a shipwreck at the bottom of the Aegean. The mundane facts are established. It is genuinely ancient, genuinely Greek, genuinely real, studied for decades by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, using X-ray tomography that revealed its hidden gears and the tiny inscriptions on its surface, a user's manual in bronze. But the questions it raises are not mundane at all. If the Greeks could build this, what else could they build? Why is there no other example, no predecessor, no successor, no mention of a workshop that made such things? A technology this advanced does not spring from nothing and vanish into nothing. It implies a lost tradition of craftsmanship that existed, produced this, and then disappeared so completely that we would not believe it had ever existed if this single waterlogged lump had not survived on the seafloor. And the sea is not done with the wreck. Jacques Cousteau dived the site in the 1950s and again in the 1970s. Modern expeditions have returned in recent years and are still finding things. More statue fragments, more artifacts, and in 2016, a human skeleton, the bones of someone who went down with the ship 2,000 years ago, preserved in the sediment. The wreck lies deep enough that it remains genuinely dangerous. The divers who work it now use rebreathers and exosuits and careful decompression schedules, and even so, this is water that has already proven it will kill the people who reach into it. What was a device like the mechanism doing on a cargo ship? Who built it? And what happened to the workshop that could produce a computer 14 centuries before the rest of the world caught up? The Aegean guarded that answer with 150 feet of water and the life of a diver. And the next thing the sea swallowed was not a ship or a machine. It was an entire city. Number 8. Thonis-Heracleion. For nearly 1,000 years, the greatest port in Egypt stood where the Nile poured into the Mediterranean Sea. Every ship that wanted to trade with Egypt passed through it. It held the great customs house that taxed the wealth of the ancient world as it came and went. It held a temple to the god Amun so important that pharaohs came here to receive the title that made them legitimate rulers. Its harbors were crowded with ships, its canals threaded between temples and houses, and its name was known across the Greek and Egyptian worlds. The Greeks called it Heracleion, the Egyptians called it Thonis. And then, in a span of time that on the scale of a 1,000-year city amounts to the blink of an eye, it was gone. Not conquered, not burned, not abandoned, drowned. The sea rose up and took the entire city, and swallowed it so completely that later generations were not sure it had ever been real. For centuries, the only evidence that Thonis-Heracleion had existed was writing. The Greek historian Herodotus, in the 5th century BC, described visiting the city and told a story that the legendary lovers Helen and Paris had stopped there before the Trojan War. Other ancient authors mentioned it, but there was no city. No ruins on the coast, no field of broken columns, nothing a traveler could point to. Just a name in old books, and a growing consensus among modern scholars that Heracleion was probably a myth, a place the ancient writers had exaggerated or confused with somewhere else. A city that grand, that important, does not simply vanish without leaving a trace on dry land. So it must not have been real. It was real. In the year 2000, the French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudiot, after years of methodical survey, found it. Thonis-Heracleion was lying on the seafloor of Aboukir Bay, about 4 miles off the modern Egyptian coast, under roughly 30 feet of water and a blanket of sediment that had hidden it for more than 1,000 years. And it was all still there. Colossal statues of pharaohs and gods, more than 16 feet tall, toppled on the seabed. The great temple of Amun, dozens of smaller shrines, gold jewelry, coins, and ritual objects. Inscribed slabs of stone, including one that finally proved Thonis and Heracleion were two names, Egyptian and Greek, for the same single city, ending a debate that had run for generations. Herodotus, dismissed as a teller of tall tales, had been describing a real place, exactly where he said it was, and it had been lying on the bottom of the sea the entire time, waiting to be believed. Here's where it gets strange. Scattered through the drowned city, Gaudiot's team found something that was sunk on purpose. In one channel, they discovered more than 60 ancient ships, many deliberately filled and scuttled, sent to the bottom by human hands, along with hundreds of small votive offerings and the remains of ritual deposits. This was not just a harbor where ships happened to sink. Part of the sunken city preserves the residue of ceremony, of things given to the water intentionally, the same instinct we have seen in a Mexican cenote and will see again in a lake high in the Andes. The people of Thonis-Heracleion, like so many cultures on this list, brought their offerings to the edge of the water and let the water take them, and then the water took everything. The cause of the drowning is now understood in its broad outlines, and it is a slow-motion catastrophe. The city was built on unstable ground, on waterlogged clay and sand deposited by the Nile at the edge of the sea. Over centuries, the weight of the great stone temples and statues, combined with rising sea levels and the sudden shocks of earthquakes, caused the soft ground beneath the city to liquefy and fail. Land that had held temples for centuries turned, in moments of seismic violence, into something with the consistency of quicksand, and the monuments dropped straight down into it. Piece by piece, over a period running from around the 2nd century BC to the 8th century AD, the entire city subsided beneath the waves and was gone. Consider how thoroughly it disappeared. A metropolis that every major power in the Mediterranean knew by name sank so completely that within a few centuries the educated world doubted it had ever stood. If not for a stubborn line in Herodotus and one archaeologist willing to spend years dragging survey equipment across an empty bay, we would still think it was a legend. Which raises the question that hangs over this whole list. How many other cities, named in old texts and dismissed as myth, are lying intact under the sediment offshore, waiting for someone to look in the right place? Gaudio and his teams have been excavating Thonis-Heracleion for more than 2 decades, and by their own estimate they have uncovered only a small fraction of it, perhaps 5%. The rest is still down there in the dark green water of the bay, the streets, the houses, the untouched shrines, and whatever was sealed inside the great temple of Amun when the ground gave way and the sea closed over the roof. A city Herodotus swore was real, that the world called a fairy tale, that turned out to be lying exactly where he said. From a city that sank into the sea by accident, we climb now to the roof of the world, to a lake where a temple may have been placed under the water on purpose. Number 9. Lake Titicaca. The year is 2000. You're a diver in the highest large lake on Earth, more than 12,500 feet above sea level, on the border between Bolivia and Peru, where the air holds so little oxygen that hauling your gear to the water leaves you gasping, and the cold of the snowmelt lake bites straight through your suit. You drop below the surface into water that is dim and green and shockingly clear, and you descend along a slope of ancient stone, and your light lands on a wall. A straight, worked, deliberate wall of fitted stone, running away into the depths in both directions, far too long and far too regular to be anything the lake made on its own. You are looking at a structure that human hands built, and that the water has been hiding for a very long time. Lake Titicaca is one of the most sacred bodies of water in the Americas. To the Inca, whose empire once ruled these highlands, Titicaca was the birthplace of the world. Their creation story held that the god Viracocha rose from the lake to make the sun, the moon, and the first people, and that the founding ancestors of the Inca themselves emerged from its waters. But the Inca were latecomers to this shore. 1,000 years before them, the great civilization of Tiwanaku built its monumental city just south of the lake and regarded the water with the same reverence. For thousands of years, across the rise and fall of these Andean cultures, Lake Titicaca was holy, and holy water in the ancient world was almost never left empty. It was a place you gave things to. In the year 2000, an international expedition using divers and remote survey reported submerged structures on the lakebed, and described what they interpreted as a temple-like complex, along with a long wall and what appeared to be a terrace or road, resting under the water off the Bolivian shore. The claims were bold, and some remained debated. But the debate over any single structure was soon overtaken by something harder to argue with, recovered a short distance away. Off a reef called Qua, near the Island of the Sun, the sacred island where the Inca said the sun itself was born, a Belgian and Bolivian team led by the archaeologist Christophe Dallaire spent years in the 2010s carefully mapping and recovering what lay on the lakebed. They brought up thousands of objects, and these were not the debris of a city that had sunk. These were offerings, dropped into the water deliberately, one ceremony at a time, over the course of many centuries. Gold ornaments. Delicately carved objects of shell, including spondylus, a spiny oyster that comes only from the warm ocean hundreds of miles away, and was among the most precious ritual materials in the Andes. stone incense burners shaped like pumas, and the bones of young llamas sacrificed and sent to the bottom of the lake as gifts to the powers the people believed lived within it. Here's where it gets strange, and it is the same strangeness that runs like a thread through this entire list. Across cultures that never met, on different continents, separated by oceans and by thousands of years, human beings arrived independently at the identical conviction that the way to speak to the divine was to give your most valuable things to deep water and let it swallow them where no one could ever take them back. The Maya threw gold and children into a cenote. The Egyptians scuttled ships and sank offerings in a drowning city. And here, on the roof of the Andes, in the thin, cold air 12,000 feet up, the people of Tiwanaku and the Inca dropped gold and shell and sacrificed animals into the sacred lake, century after century, in a sustained transaction with the water. Nobody taught them to do this. They all decided it on their own, or they all remembered something none of us can quite reach, and most of it is still down there. The recovered offerings represent only what the divers have reached in a few mapped locations. Lake Titicaca is enormous, more than 100 miles long, and in places it plunges to nearly 1,000 feet, far beyond the reach of the archaeologists who have worked the shallows. The bulk of the lake floor has never been surveyed, and around it clings one of the most persistent legends in South America, a lost city of gold beneath the water, a submerged Inca treasure the Spanish never found because the Inca, in the chaos of the conquest, threw the last of their gold into the lake to keep it from the invaders. Bolivia has spoken for years of building an underwater museum for what lies off the island of the Sunday. The plans have stalled. The offerings stay where the ancients put them, in the cold and the dark, under the highest sacred water in the world. Why did every one of these cultures, with no contact between them, decide that deep water was the one door to the gods that could never be reopened? What is resting in the deep, undived center of Lake Titicaca, below the reach of anyone who has ever tried? And how much of what the Inca gave to the water in their final desperate days is still there, waiting under half a mile of cold blue water for a technology or a permission that has not yet come? The lake keeps its gifts, and the last water on this list is not keeping offerings or bones or a lost civilization. It is keeping 15 million years of sealed darkness under 2.5 miles of ice at the bottom of the world. Number 10. Lake Vostok. The year is 2012. You are a glaciologist at Vostok Station, a Russian research outpost in the deep interior of East Antarctica, hundreds of miles from the nearest coast, more than 11,000 feet above sea level, on a featureless plateau of ice that extends to every horizon without a single landmark. The temperature outside has reached minus 128 degrees Fahrenheit here, the lowest air temperature ever recorded on the surface of the Earth. The station is staffed by a small rotating crew, and the ice beneath their boots goes down 2.5 miles before it reaches anything else. But it does reach something. Airborne radar surveys and decades of careful drilling have confirmed that beneath 2.5 miles of Antarctic ice, there is a lake. A body of water roughly the size of Lake Ontario, 150 miles long, 30 miles wide, holding a volume of water that has been sealed from the atmosphere, from sunlight, and from all surface life on this planet for somewhere between 15 and 35 million years. And today, your drill has just broken through the last feet of ice into open water below. For the first time in geological history, the lake is connected to the sky. Lake Vostok cannot be visited. There is no shore. There is no surface to land on. There is no way in except through 2.5 miles of solid ice, and no technology that can deliver a person through that ice and return them alive. The lake sits in sealed darkness under the weight of the entire Antarctic ice sheet, kept liquid by the pressure from above and by geothermal heat from the rock below, in water so old and so still that the deepest layers may have been sitting undisturbed for millions of years. When this lake was sealed, there were no polar ice caps. There were no humans. The continent was drifting toward the pole, the ice was accumulating overhead, and the lake was slowly cut off from the rest of the world. Since that moment, nothing from outside has entered it, and nothing from inside has escaped. The Russian drilling team worked toward the lake for more than 20 years, stopping short of the water for long periods while scientists argued about whether to proceed. The concern was not physical danger, it was contamination. The lake might be harboring life that had been evolving in complete isolation for tens of millions of years, and drilling through with a fluid-coated drill risked introducing surface organisms into an ecosystem that had never encountered any of them. The debate had the texture of an ethical argument about touching an artifact from another world. In the end, the drill broke through in February 2012, and the pressurized lake water rose into the borehole and froze almost instantly. The team retrieved ice cores from that refrozen water. They reported finding microbial DNA sequences that did not match any known organism in any reference database. Other scientists disputed the methodology, arguing the sequences were contamination from the drill fluid itself. The argument has not been resolved. Here's where it gets strange. What makes Lake Vostok more than a geological curiosity is the parallel that no one who studies it can look away from. Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, has a liquid ocean sealed beneath a crust of ice, kept warm by the tidal pull of Jupiter above it. Enceladus, one of Saturn's moons, erupts geysers of water through its icy shell. Astrobiologists regard both as among the most plausible places in the solar system where life might exist. And when they look for a model of what that life might be and what conditions might produce it, they look at Lake Vostok. A liquid ocean, sealed under ice, kept warm from below, cut off from the surface world for geological timescales. The experiment of what happens to life under those conditions is not hypothetical. It has been running under Antarctica for 15 million years. We have touched it once, poorly, through a hole we drilled with equipment coded in the biology of the surface world. More than 400 subglacial lakes have now been identified beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, connected in places by rivers flowing in the dark under miles of ice, a hidden hydrological system whose full extent we are still mapping. Vostok is the largest. None of them has ever been directly examined. Their floors have not been sampled. Whatever evolved in them across millions of years has not been identified or named. The debate over the 2012 findings has not been settled. The microbial sequences remain unidentified. A follow-up probe, designed for the kind of sterile entry the original drill could not provide, has been proposed but not funded, not built, not sent. The lake is still there, under the ice, in the dark, not waiting for anything, because it does not know it is being waited on. It has been there for 15 million years without a name, without a human culture knowing it existed, without a single thing from the surface world crossing into it. What lives there, if anything lives there, has had 15 million years of uninterrupted isolation to become whatever it has become. 10 bodies of water, and all of them are still holding what they took. From a desert pit called the Door to Hell, to a Himalayan lake full of ancient bones, from a flooded cave holding the oldest girl in the Americas, to a cenote hiding a river inside itself, from a lake that petrifies the living to a sacred well of sacrifice, from a shipwreck guarding an impossible machine to a city that drowned in a generation, from ritual gold at the roof of the world to 15 million years of sealed darkness under Antarctic ice, the pattern holds. 9 of these places were shaped by human hands or marked by human ritual. The 10th has never been touched by anything from the surface world. All of them are keeping something. The water does not ask what it holds. It simply does not let go. If you want to keep finding out, subscribe. Leave a comment telling us which of these waters you would enter if you could, and which one you would never go near. And let us know where in the world you are watching from.